In the underworld, gunshots are supposed to end stories. They close chapters, remove problems, and settle disputes in the simplest way possible. But on one night in 1958 Harlem, the sound that changed history wasn't a bang. It was a click, a hollow, mechanical failure that echoed through a crowded room and froze everyone who heard it. No blood spilled, no body fell. Yet from that moment on, the rules of power in Harlem and New York's criminal world were never the same. By the late 1952, Harlem was under constant pressure. The Italian Mafia had expanded everywhere else, swallowing neighborhoods, operations, and revenue streams with a mix of money and violence. Harlem was the exception, not because it lacked value, but because it was protected by a man who understood power differently. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just defending territory. He was defending autonomy, the idea that Harlem could not be bought, intimidated, or quietly absorbed. That made him dangerous. And when brute force failed, his enemies chose a subtler weapon. They didn't aim at his business. They didn't attack his allies. They went after trust itself. They targeted the one person who stood closest to him, the man whose presence was so familiar that no one would question it until it was too late. What makes this story extraordinary isn't the betrayal alone. Betrayal is common in the criminal world. What makes it unforgettable is what happened next. Because Bumpy Johnson knew, he knew weeks in advance. And instead of stopping the plot, instead of silencing the threat, he allowed it to unfold in front of hundreds of witnesses. This is not a story about an assassination attempt gone wrong. It's a story about control, about patience, about turning an enemy's perfect plan into a public lesson, and about why. Sometimes, the most terrifying moment isn't when the trigger is pulled, but when nothing happens at all. By 1958, Harlem was no longer just a neighborhood fighting to survive, it was a prize everyone wanted to claim. The numbers racket had grown into one of the most reliable underground cash machines in New York, fueled by thousands of small bets that added up to millions each year. To the Italian Mafia, it was unfinished business. Everywhere else, they had imposed order through money, fear, or both. Harlem remained the last major exception. What made Harlem different wasn't geography, it was structure. The money stayed local, the disputes were handled internally, and the community understood exactly who stood between them and complete takeover. Bumpy Johnson didn't run Harlem like a distant executive. He was present, visible in clubs, restaurants, churches, and back rooms where decisions were actually made. That visibility created stability, but it also made him a constant target. By the late 1952, pressure was coming from every direction. Mafia-connected politicians pushed zoning changes, police harassment increased on black-owned businesses, middlemen appeared offering partnerships that were thinly veiled takeovers. Each move was calculated, designed to test Harlem's defenses without triggering open war. The message was clear. Eventually, resistance would become too expensive. But Harlem didn't collapse, it tightened. That resistance frustrated the five families more than outright defiance ever could. Violence, they understood. Intimidation was familiar territory. But Harlem didn't respond the way other neighborhoods had. Killings created backlash. Bribes stalled. Threats spread faster than fear, turning ordinary people into eyes and ears. The cost of escalation kept rising, and the returns kept shrinking. This was the moment Harlem stopped being seen as just a lucrative operation and started being viewed as a strategic problem. The question was no longer how do we take it, but why hasn't it fallen already? Every answer led back to the same name. Not a crew, not an organization. One man whose authority came from loyalty rather than rank. And that made the situation dangerous for everyone involved. When force fails repeatedly, smart enemies change tactics. They stop pushing from the outside and start looking inward. They search for fractures, pressure points, and human weaknesses that can't be defended with guns. Harlem's defenses were strong, but they weren't abstract. They were human. That realization marked a turning point. The siege on Harlem was no longer about territory. It was about trust. Every power structure has a flaw, and it's never the enemy at the gate. It's the person standing closest to the throne. By 1958, Bumpy Johnson understood this better than most men alive. Harlem trusted him because he trusted carefully. But even careful trust creates vulnerability, especially when it becomes routine. A bodyguard isn't just protection, he's access. He knows schedules, habits, blind spots. He stands where no one else is allowed to stand. Over time, that proximity becomes invisible. Presence turns into background, and that's what makes it so dangerous. When someone is always there, people stop seeing them as a variable. In Harlem, Bumpy's inner circle was small by design. Loyalty wasn't distributed freely. It was earned through years of pressure, shared risk, and quiet tests that most people never noticed. But no system is immune to human limits. Hunger, fear, family, illness, these forces don't announce themselves. They build quietly, behind closed doors, until they outweigh principles that once seemed unbreakable. This is where outside enemies begin to win without firing a shot. The Italian Mafia didn't need chaos. They needed leverage. They understood that no man, no matter how loyal, exists in isolation. Everyone carries something home with them at night, responsibilities, regrets, worries that don't disappear just because they work for a powerful boss. And unlike violence, leverage doesn't leave marks. It doesn't attract attention. It works slowly, invisibly. For Bumpy, the danger wasn't betrayal itself. Betrayal was expected. The real threat was what betrayal represented. Proof that loyalty could be priced, that Harlem's internal bonds could be manipulated from the outside. If that idea took hold, it would spread faster than any mafia crew ever could. That's why this moment mattered so much. Bumpy wasn't facing an assassination problem. He was facing a legitimacy problem. If someone closest to him could be turned quietly, then Harlem's power structure wasn't as solid as it appeared. And once that doubt existed, the 5 families wouldn't stop with one attempt. They would repeat the process until something broke. Most men in Bumpy's position would react instinctively, remove the threat, eliminate the risk, restore order through force. But Bumpy Johnson didn't think in reactions. He thought in consequences. And the consequence of acting too early would have been far worse than waiting. When violence fails, organized crime doesn't retreat, it adapts. By the late 1950s, the 5 families understood that Harlem could not be taken by force without triggering a war that would cost more than it paid. So, they shifted strategies. Instead of confronting Bumpy Johnson directly, they focused on something far more fragile than territory: people. This was the Mafia's most refined weapon. They didn't need intimidation in public or assassinations in the street. They needed pressure applied quietly, where no one else could see it. Bills, illness, family obligations, fear of the future. These were forces that didn't provoke retaliation because they didn't look like attacks. They looked like reality. The genius of this approach was its deniability. If a man broke, it wasn't because he was threatened, it was because he made a choice. And that distinction mattered. A choice could be exploited again. A choice could be framed as weakness. And weakness, once identified, became contagious. The Mafia knew that turning one trusted figure would do more than remove a leader. It would destabilize confidence throughout Harlem. Every bodyguard, runner, and associate would begin to wonder who else could be bought. Paranoia would replace unity. Suspicion would fracture loyalty from the inside. This is why the target mattered more than the act. Killing Bumpy would make him a martyr. Turning someone close to him would make him vulnerable. One outcome strengthened Harlem. The other hollowed it out. What the Mafia underestimated was Bumpy's understanding of human behavior. He didn't believe in incorruptible men. He believed in predictable pressures. He knew that every person, no matter how loyal, could be tested by circumstances beyond their control. That knowledge didn't make him cynical. It made him prepared. More importantly, Bumpy knew that stopping one attempt wouldn't stop the strategy. Even if he neutralized a single traitor, the five families would simply find another pressure point, another person with a sick child, another man drowning in debt, another weakness waiting to be exploited. The attack wasn't aimed at his life. It was aimed at his system. And systems aren't defended with bullets. They're defended with messages so clear and public that no one misunderstands the cost of betrayal or the futility of manipulation. That's why Bumpy didn't rush to act. He waited, because to defeat this kind of attack, he needed more than survival. He needed proof. Knowing a threat exists is one thing. Choosing not to stop it is another. When Bumpy Johnson realized that someone close to him was being tested, he didn't respond the way most men would have. There were no confrontations, no sudden disappearances, no warnings sent through intermediaries. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inside, everything did. For 3 weeks, Bumpy did what he had always done best. He observed. He paid attention not to words, but to behavior. Small changes mattered more than confessions, a hesitation that hadn't been there before, a nervous glance at the wrong moment, silence where confidence used to be. These weren't signs of guilt, yet they were signs of pressure. And pressure, Bumpy knew, came from somewhere specific. Acting too soon would have been easy. Removing a potential threat would restore short-term safety, but it would solve nothing. The five families weren't betting on one man. They were testing a method. If the attempt failed quietly, they would try again and again, each time with more sophistication, more leverage, more patience. Bumpy understood that this wasn't about stopping an assassination. It was about ending a strategy. To do that, he needed the betrayal to complete itself. Not in secret, but in public. Not as rumor, but as fact. Harlem needed to see what happened when outside money tried to buy inside loyalty. And the Mafia needed to understand that even their best plays were already anticipated. So Bumpy created space. He let the clock run. He allowed the tension to build naturally, knowing that the weight of the decision would push the traitor toward action. Silence became the trap. Every day without intervention made the choice harder to reverse and more revealing when it finally came. This waiting wasn't passive. It was calculated restraint. Behind the scenes, Bumpy adjusted pieces on the board, ensuring that when the moment arrived, it would unfold exactly where and how he wanted it to. A crowded room, familiar faces, no shadows to hide in, no version of events that could be denied later. By refusing to intervene early, Bumpy shifted the burden of action entirely onto the other side. The Mafia had to commit. The traitor had to choose. And once that choice was made, there would be no ambiguity about who controlled the situation. 3 weeks passed like this. Calm on the surface. Pressure underneath. The kind of calm that only exists when someone already knows how the story ends. By the time the night arrived, the outcome was no longer in question. All that remained was to let it happen. The night it happened didn't feel unusual at first. That was the brilliance of it. The club was full, the music steady, conversations layered over one another in the familiar chaos of a Harlem weekend. This was exactly the kind of place where nothing stood out and where everything mattered. For Bumpy Johnson, routine wasn't comfort. It was camouflage. Crowds are powerful witnesses. They remember. They talk, and they turn private acts into public truth. That's why this moment couldn't happen in an alley or a hallway. It had to unfold in a room full of people who knew the faces, understood the relationships, and could never pretend they hadn't seen what happened. The man closest to Bumpy moved the way he always did. That was the final deception. No one questioned his presence. No one sensed danger. Proximity had erased suspicion. And that was the point the Mafia had been counting on: familiarity as a weapon. When the hand went inside the jacket, the room didn't react. When the aim was taken, no one shouted. Time narrowed to a single motion, a single decision, a single sound that was supposed to end everything. Instead, there was nothing. Not silence, something worse. A mechanical click that carried farther than any gunshot could have. A sound that didn't belong. In that instant, the entire room understood the same thing at once. A line had been crossed, and it hadn't gone the way it was meant to. What mattered next wasn't speed or strength. It was composure. Bumpy didn't jump. He didn't shout. He didn't reach for protection. He did something far more unsettling. He took his time. That calm confirmed what the click had already suggested. This wasn't chaos. It was exposure. The crowd watched as the truth rearranged itself in real time. The man with the gun wasn't an attacker from the outside. He was someone from within. And now, stripped of the outcome he'd been promised, he stood alone in a room full of people who suddenly understood exactly what had almost happened. This was the moment Bumpy had been waiting for. Not because his life had been spared, but because the betrayal had revealed itself without argument. There was no denial possible, no alternate story, no rumor to control. The attempt existed in the open, witnessed by hundreds, impossible to erase. By allowing the trigger to be pulled and to fail, Bumpy transformed a private plot into a public lesson. The Mafia's strategy didn't just collapse, it was humiliated. Their money hadn't bought silence, it had bought exposure. And in the criminal world, exposure is permanent. The shot that never fired did more damage than a successful assassination ever could have. It proved that Bumpy Johnson wasn't reacting to threats. He was staging their defeat. By the time the room settled and the music slowly returned, something irreversible had happened. No one needed explanations. No speeches were required. Everyone understood the message. Bumpy Johnson had just demonstrated a form of power the Mafia could not counter: foresight. The five families believed control came from money, from fear, from the ability to turn a man against his own. That night proved the limits of that thinking. They hadn't exposed a weakness in Harlem. They had exposed their own. Every move they made had already been seen, anticipated, and quietly redirected. The assassination attempt failed not because of luck, but because it was never allowed to succeed in the first place. What made the moment unforgettable wasn't mercy or cruelty, it was clarity. Betrayal was revealed without bloodshed, loyalty was tested in public, and the cost of manipulation became unmistakable. From that point on, buying influence inside Harlem stopped being a strategy. It became a warning. Bumpy didn't survive because he was untouchable. He survived because he understood something most powerful men ignore. Knowing what's coming is more valuable than reacting to it. He didn't just protect himself, he protected the structure that held Harlem together. By turning an enemy's plan into a lesson witnessed by hundreds, he made sure it would never be repeated. The Mafia retreated, not out of respect, but out of calculation. Every future attempt would carry the risk of the same humiliation. Every dollar spent could become evidence of failure. Harlem had proven it wasn't vulnerable to infiltration. It was immune to it. In the end, the most dangerous weapon in that room was never the gun that failed to fire. It was the man who allowed it to be pulled, because real power doesn't rush to stop threats. It waits until they reveal themselves.